Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rehash, a Web3 podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and on this episode, we're speaking with Magenta Ceiba, Principal Systems Architect at Bloom Network, about how we can use blockchain technology to empower local communities in their grassroots ecological efforts, where Magenta sees the future of regenerative finance going, and how to best organize communities in a decentralized, yet still well-managed and organized way. Bloom Network is a community network that helps people find and participate in grassroots climate and social repair wherever they live around the world. They've implemented various aspects of blockchain technology and Web3 concepts to fund their network and their people through retroactive funding mechanisms and community tokens, and they take a balanced approach to governance that I think any DAO or any online community can learn from. Magenta mentions a number of projects and resources in this episode, and I've tried to link all of them in the show notes. So if you're interested in learning more about the projects she mentions, or are looking for reputable nonprofit organizations that support various ecological causes you care about to donate to, be sure to check out the links in the show notes, or go to our Mirror or Substack pages at rehash.mirror.xyz or rehashweb3.substack.com. Magenta was nominated by Fifth World Zach and voted onto the podcast by Karsten, Chark, Spencer Graham, and Fifth World Zach. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Magenta. Hi, Magenta. Welcome to Rehash. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Diana. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. So I want to dive right on in because we have so much to talk about with the work that you've done in this regenerative finance space and using Web3 and blockchain technology in ways that we don't typically think of, in non-DeFi, non-NFT ways, and making a good impact on the world. You know, a lot of times when we talk about crypto and blockchain, one of the messages that we send out into the world, right, is how crypto and blockchain tech can level the playing field for everyone and make our society more equal. But a lot of times, at least for me working in the space, it's hard to actually see that play out in my day-to-day in the crypto ecosystem. But from what I've seen about Bloom Network, it seems like Bloom is actually using blockchain for good in many of these ways. So to start off, could you just provide some context and background for our listeners on what is Bloom Network and what are some of the challenges that you faced with, first of all, financing Bloom that actually helped unlock some learnings that you still use with Bloom today?
Sure. I'll try to concisely explain Bloom. It's a very unique kind of thing. So first of all, there are local hubs on the ground in, I think, 12 different countries right now. There's somewhere around 30 of them. And they're basically local coalitions between people doing regional economic systems. People building food security is what they most commonly work on because it's like culture and economics and food access and like relationship healing kind of stuff. So they're networking, you know, different farmers in a region, different kinds of projects. It's very open as long as they're broadly organizing around regenerative cultures. So that's everything from food to justice to taking care of water. Watershed repair is the other most common thing that the local Bloom hubs are doing. And this has been going on since 2008. They also do like science stuff. So there's a group doing bioremediation. They're studying different species of sunflowers on a lot in Baltimore to study which of them are most effective at pulling lead out of the soil so that the land is safe for kids to be on and ultimately returned to local food production if they can. So yeah, we have like 16 years of wisdom built up from doing this kind of organizing around the world, people doing skill shares with each other around this, building economic power together. Alternative economies has always been one of our focuses. And so when we initially started, it was an online social network. It was under a parent company, and the local hubs formed through that. And the parent company ended up taking that network down, and we needed to separate from them anyway. So it took us a really long time to raise enough capital to be able to make the network again because we had so many power dynamic problems when it was a top-down hierarchy before. And obviously that's a pattern that's, you know, in a lot of places and contexts, right? So we did a lot of deep governance design work on that and like strategizing and really healing work around what are these dynamics of historical power imbalances and colonization and the ways these play out at like every layer of our society that's making it difficult for people to do what they love and care for each other and be connected with nature and so forth, and have the time to work on climate stuff in between like day jobs and families, etc. So that's kind of what's going on the ground. And then thanks to Gitcoin and Giveth, starting at the end of 2020, and especially in 2021, beginning of 2022, we were able to raise enough capital to put the online network together through blockchain funding. The network is a full-featured social network. There are profiles, there are local pages. Each local bloom has its own local media feed, so you can go see what's happening in your community, and it's all oriented around local action. So people are posting events that are happening, actions that are happening. I think it's like 67% of the population, probably more now, believes we're in a climate emergency. But like for a lot of people, it's hard for them to find what they can do. It's really overwhelming. It's really hard to find grassroots projects on the ground if you're not somehow bumping into one of them in your neighborhood or something. And so it's just like really this discovery engine for people to find these kinds of projects and plug in with their professional skill sets, or just come out and help build a garden or whatever. So the network is all oriented around peer-to-peer resource sharing. You know, we figured out how to do local food policy in our city. Here's how you can do it where you live, and save yourself 10 years of really difficult work. And then there's like a tokenomics system with it, basically, and maybe we can go into that later. But it's basically like an always-on retroactive public goods funding approach, where as people are reporting on their website, making their work visible in a way that's more public and outside of their little black holes of mainstream media platforms, where the public is never going to be able to find their content for the most part. And so we're like, make a place to aggregate that, make yourself known. We'll teach each other to like do higher level impact reporting as we go, so that more of these groups can access grants. Because that's one of the main problems, is these grassroots ways of organizing. They're collaborative, they're decentralized. Nonprofit funding mechanisms have no idea what to do with these people. They don't have enough data for them. They don't have a like centralized structure that institutions can interact with and this kind of thing. So that's why these blockchain tools are such a perfect fit for that kind of organizing. And in many cases, the only way these groups are able to access funds. So anyway, once they post their actions on the website, it has a little impact reporting form, basically. Then they'll receive Flow for Flowers. That's like our cooperative patronage token. So Bloom, right now it's a nonprofit, but we like spent a lot of time last year with lawyers making a federated DAO. It's like a DAO co-op hybrid. So each local Bloom home is technically a co-owner, as well as individual members. It's like co-op stuff, but like they co-own the platform and co-govern its development. And then at the end of the year, once they have tokens accrued from reporting their actions, making them visible, teaching other people how to do them in other places, then as we build our grants pool and profits from the different revenue streams we're setting up, that will go proportionally to people with their token holdings. The reason for that is to mitigate the risk, because we are like frontline communities. There's no leeway for us to expose them to legal risk around token stuff. So it meshes the token approach with a pre-existing cooperative law, like a grocery co-op or REI or something, to basically use a reputation token to distribute profits. So that's one of the Web3 pieces of the website. That was a long intro to what Bloom is. I'll stop there.
Yeah, there's so many pieces I'm really curious to learn more about. And I guess to start off, I'm curious to know how you've seen the community change from essentially a co-op of sorts to then implementing blockchain technology and implementing the Flow token and giving people more of a slice of ownership. How has that transition looked in practice? And Bloom, like having started out as more of just like a grassroots co-op type of thing with a lot of local communities, I would imagine that most of the members of these local communities were not already familiar with blockchain and crypto. And so was there a lot of education that you had to do around teaching people what blockchain technology is, what this token is, explaining the tokenomics to them? Or was it more intuitive to them than maybe we would expect?
Well, one thing to clarify is that we just finished our smart contracts, and we have a white paper that a few of the local hubs have read. We're preparing a training for them. One of our co-founders is a professional technology trainer, so I can share with you some of the insights that she understands of what's missing from the trainings that we're seeing that are out there. But until we plug in the wallet and then hook in the smart contracts, that's the point at which we'll train people And it'll be very basic, like how to use a wallet, what is cryptocurrency. But even before that, like what gives money value? We have to train our people on that level because these are people who are mostly harmed by the existing economy. And it makes no sense to them. A lot of them have random jobs to make ends meet, and they're not able to do the care work that is their highest expression of their skills, really. So anyway, that's what Meg Rivers, she's the pro tech trainer. She's been preparing to start with that. And I think that's what generally we've been finding missing for people to even be able to grab onto what is cryptocurrency, like what is money and how does it have meaning to us. A lot of that learning curve is going to end up being as well teaching people like, hey, you have control over saying what has value here and why it has value. And it's a very distributed process of us deciding that together. And yeah, I think it's going to take a long time because ultimately like Bloom is setting up a parallel economic system. It's also hybrid works as a community currency, which our people are familiar with from like time banks, and they've done local community currencies and stuff. So I don't think the technical parts of it are going to be really hard for them actually, because they have such a gap into any kind of money that is meaningfully useful to them. Like, because this is so yoked to you're being paid for doing the work that you're not getting paid right now, that's the most important thing to you in the world. That makes it really easy for them to go over the technical hurdles because they're like, okay, this is a little awkward, but wow, I'm actually getting paid to do this work. Oh, okay, yeah, let's go.
Yeah, there's almost fewer hurdles you have to jump through because there's like fewer walls you have to break down or preconceptions that you have to undo and unexplain to these people because they're starting from, you know, almost like fewer assumptions than somebody who is more familiar with the tech is what it sounds like. Yeah, I think that onboarding process is something that a lot of communities are struggling with, whether we're talking about local climate organizations or we're talking about creators, which is sort of the world that I live in a lot, like artists and musicians and people like that who are familiar with the technology, but helping them to understand and onboard is still a challenge. I think no matter what community you're talking about, onboarding is a challenge. So I'm very excited to see the program that Meg Rivers ends up developing for Bloom and how she implements the training. And if she's willing to share too, you know, I think it would be extremely helpful for everybody else working in the space to learn from some of her learnings. And I think we should all share actually very openly with one another what we're learning from our community so that we can further this process along and not all be making the same mistakes over and over again. Learning from each other. Yeah. So I would love to hear more about how you've structured the tokenomics for Bloom that you're planning on implementing.
Yeah, so I've been calling it a regenerative actions protocol, or RAP. So we have this list of, I think it's like 600 impact actions that we've found over the years from all this R&D in so many different places, like what works to establish permanent economic sovereignty in a community. And that is, in our context, interconnected with climate stuff. So instead of something like carbon credits, where you have this top-down, very technical, scientific, sometimes you have to learn how to use hardware and stuff, reporting process that's inaccessible to most small-scale and grassroots groups, so far anyway. Instead of that, people are putting the impact that they know is meaningful to them and recording that. Eventually, they'll use specific methodologies related to what specific things they're working on so that they can access more funding pools and we can adapt how effective we're being together. That's one difference in our tokenomics setup, is that it's community defined. The other aspect of it is that the individual person gets flow. At first, we're just pegging it to like 30 flow per hour. So it's roughly an experience of, if I was getting paid hourly to do this, this is what it would look like, which is just to make it visible and empower each other. And then their community, their local Bloom DAO, once we set those up, is going to get a 1.2x multiplier of that. And that's so we incentivize them to learn how to build a local treasury and manage that themselves, because on both sides of it, the aid and the investor dynamic in the types of work they're doing is both problematic, power dynamic wise and structurally. So the more we can teach them, hey, you can use this and run your own treasury, invest in local projects, pay a couple community organizers a stipend once a month, whatever you guys need to do, whatever you determine is most effective to support your broader community. you have the autonomy to make those decisions yourself. The other piece of it that, we'll wait until after we have prototypes with a few blooms, like using a DAO. We're going to probably roll that out slowly and just with a couple of them at first. But the other piece that we want to program into the token is so that members can exchange it with each other. So say I have 5,000 flow from doing beach cleanups or something, and I really need a massage. I wouldn't normally be able to afford it, but there's someone in my community who's also a member of Bloom Network who offers 4 hours a month that she'll accept flow tokens for. We actually mapped this all out in this big matrix of things people have in surplus and things people need. We're like, yeah, we're all cash poor, but clearly we can directly support each other through this process. So let's formalize that so we can get this liquidity of the real values we have to exchange with each other. Exactly like grassroots economics, as far as I understand. And so anyway, I would give, say, 50 flow to her or whatever. I would have a massage. And then at the year end, she would get the dividend and grants pool. So that's kind of our working hypothesis of how to integrate a cooperative patronage approach with a community currency, because community currencies tend to have the value collapses to zero pretty quickly. It's like 95% or much higher than that, actually, I think. And by that, I mean like you're using a local currency, like the dollar of your city or something. And there's a few problems that happen there. Either the value ends up pooling in one or two businesses, and then it's not circulating enough and the value drops, or just not enough people use it, that kind of thing. So we're hoping by inserting the profits and grants from the company in that loop, the value of their flow is connected with how much value we're producing as a community, both in terms of these multiple kind of deep values that are important to us, like building more biodiversity, having more food sovereignty, more people being able to access land in cooperative ways, this kind of thing. And then also slowly transitioning, if we're successful, like really transitioning money from these extractive economies into these local circular regenerative systems that are operating within the boundaries of the regional flows that we live within. So that's the engineering behind it. It's really like an agorist approach of let's set something up that can catch money from the extractive systems and it parses to them. We can use the local DAOs as a regional verifier so that institutions that need higher level reporting can refer to how Bloom Network is supporting that through our interface. And they can contribute money into the local DAO and know that we're trustworthy enough that that local DAO can then distribute it to the tiny projects that otherwise aren't able to access funding. So that's kind of the mechanism of wealth transfer we're working on.
Gotcha. That is super cool. It reminds me of Gitcoin funding a lot too, or just public goods funding in general. Is that where you pulled a lot of the ideas for this model from?
No, I mean, like I said, we've been experimenting with this for a long time. So it's kind of combining a lot of things we've experimented with on a local level. There's a Medium article from Spork DAO about their setup, and I think that's the closest thing I actually was like, this makes sense to how we set it up. So I kind of adapted the tokenomics model mostly based off of that, and then referencing, all these other very hyper-local dynamics that are going on in Bloom.
I don't know how many of you know this about me, but my path to podcasting and Web3 was actually quite nonlinear. From being a lawyer to a travel blogger to a podcaster and so many other little things in between. Because of this convoluted journey, I've always struggled with how to tell my full story via traditional means like a resume or LinkedIn bio, and I always felt there was so much context missing from these mediums that probably left any potential client or employer reading it totally confused about who I am or what I can offer. So while I absolutely love certain aspects of being self-employed, like being my own boss and being able to set my own schedule, there are other aspects that have been a constant source of frustration, like the fact that existing apps and tooling don't seem to be built for self-employed people at all. That's why I'm so excited about Quest, a new platform that lets me record all of my contributions on-chain, decide which projects I want to showcase, and take control of my professional identity. To follow along with our Rehash quests and check out my profile, you can sign up at quest.com/DC so you never miss an episode and create your own Quest profile today. I'm also curious to know how you've seen the community rise up and take leadership action when Bloom moved from having more of like a corporate hierarchical structure to separating from the parent company and now being more decentralized, having more of a flat structure? I think this is something that a lot of DAOs have struggled with, is they want to have this flat decentralized structure, but what that often leads to is mass chaos. No one really knows what their roles are. No one knows how much power or agency they are able to have within their organization. And so then either nothing gets done or too much gets done and it's very disorganized and it's not really meeting any goals. How have you seen that play out with the local hubs within Bloom?
Well, the local hubs themselves are slightly different than the dynamics we have at the global level, just because they're so much smaller scale usually. Yeah. So there's kind of two different layers there. But also I would say no one should be trying to make a DAO that's flat. I've never seen it work. It doesn't work in peer-to-peer organizing either. So I trained for 3 years with this group called Radical Women, which trains women, especially queer women of color, to be leaders in social movements. And then you respect the leadership of people for their like true background and knowledge and leadership. And so you have roles for just like, these people are responsible for getting these things done and making sure this decision happens. But you operate with a culture of respect and getting to know each other for those true leadership dynamics. And so DAOs are amazing because we have much more sophisticated structure to allow those nested hierarchies or more complex leadership infrastructure. So on a local Bloom level, especially because for the most part, these are operating as voluntary communities, there's no money involved. There's a few of them where they have formed entities and they are running businesses or nonprofits, but they'll usually have between a 2 to 6 person organizing team. And those people will self-define what roles they have based on their experience. We've now formalized, we'll recommend to them roles that they need to prevent 2 people or 1 person trying to do a whole thing and they're just spread too thin. So we're like, no, really like find a finance person in your community, find an engineer if you need the technical stuff, find a promoter so you're not doing the grassroots community relationship building and also spending a lot of time posting to websites to get the word out there about your event or action or whatever. So yeah, having roles is really good. And then once a Bloom gets to a larger stage, so there's one in Costa Rica called Diamante Bridge Collective, and they have like 20, 40 different properties in a region that are all part of their local network. And then something like, I think, around 40 independent projects. And so they have, I don't know what they call them, but essentially pods of people who are focused on agroecology projects. There's a group that's focused on finance. And so that's the next layer of complexity. And the pattern we most often see there is having a lead and 2 supports in each of those kinds of circles. And then the other principle of organizing that we found works really well in this transition from the corporation is to be able to recognize when someone is having the power grab dynamic, which is really common, especially in activism. I imagine would be very common in Web3 as well. I've experienced it in ReFi DAO, a few people have, where it's been like, wow, we thought we were doing something decentralized and like, this is your thing. I guess you can have all that money, we can't do anything about it now. So yeah, like recognizing when someone is coming in with that dynamic and as quickly as possible having a process for kicking them or dialoguing about, okay, let's get you on the same page. Sometimes it's not possible to. So I think there's a book called Swarmwise about the Swedish pirate party where the author is advocating for that kind of approach too, where you have one lead and a couple of supports in a circle. And then when you notice someone's doing the power grab thing, remove them from the leadership position. And I think that's really important because we had a lot of problems with that with the corporation too. Actually, we had these 3 older white dudes who were very old school, completely didn't understand whatsoever what was going on the ground. The messaging they were putting out, the products they started selling through the newsletter we had collected were like so out of alignment values-wise with the community and like exacerbating harm that we just spent 5 years building community around how to address and repair. So there was a lot of like yelling at them, and I kind of stepped into the leadership role of the former director of the nonprofit side of it So I got a lot of people yelling at me. And I'm like, no, just send your messages to the guy, the like new CEO. He's clearly not listening to me. And then there's a lot of like healing to do from those dynamics because it had kind of destroyed our community trust. And we had a Me Too situation before Me Too was a thing. And so dialoguing about that, I think like 12 of the local organizers came together and workshopped for probably a year, going on 2 years. We would meet regularly, and like a shaman was facilitating those things. And we'd look at, okay, let's name this dynamic that we're experiencing within this corporation situation. But usually those were often dynamics that were also in our national governments and our local governments and our neighborhoods and families. And so we looked at everything from like intergenerational trauma to narcissism and that dynamic of leadership, which is very common in both corporations and federal governments, where you have a honeypot of power. And to get that power, you put the most sociopathic person possible in it because they're going to make whatever decision. So there was a lot of deep dialogue about how do you design a power structure to be resilient to power abuse. On a cultural level, Aragon sponsored a governance hackathon that we did to then start formalizing that. And it's loosely like sociocracy, if people are familiar with that. We have circles and teams of people who focus on a certain thing. If there's a team, there's like a lead and 2 supports. And then you make sure that the different circles or groups are able to communicate with each other so that they're getting information if their decision is going to affect another group, or they'll be able to find out that, oh, that wouldn't work for this other process that's going on or something. So it's like very much not flat. It's like who is good at what? What are our gatekeeping methods so that we, as much as possible, prevent letting in people who are going to have a narcissistic or power grabby or other harmful dynamic? Like maybe they're really unaware of organizing in cross-cultural spaces or something. They need some exposure to the community before we're able to put them in a position where they have a lot of contact and power in some dynamic. So it's a very human, very deep, very multimodal leadership development and communication process that we do that's, yeah, definitely not flat.
I actually think the thing that you guys are doing with governance that is so smart, you're dealing with local physical communities of people who are working on a physical cause, but I think even purely digital communities can learn from this as well, is that you're putting the people with the most context over a thing. You're giving those people power and agency to manage that thing. And so like Exactly. What you were talking about before with when Bloom was still part of the parent company and you had these 3 people in leadership who had seemed to have no context into what these local communities were dealing with and were so out of touch, and therefore made decisions that were not just out of touch with what was actually needed, but actually harmful to the local communities and what they actually needed. That's a mistake that corporations across the board make. And I think with any kind of community, the types of governance that you want decentralized and who you want that decentralized to, it has to make sense. And it has to be that you're giving agency and power to people with the most context over that specific thing. And so it's like for us, we give our community power to decide which guests come on the podcast because they're the ones with the most context on that. They're the ones that listen to the podcast. They're the ones that know what they want to hear. And it makes way more sense to give them power to decide our guest lineup than it does, for example, to give them agency over deciding how we manage our core team treasury. So I think that's a big mistake that a lot of DAOs make, is trying to give everyone in the community power to govern everything. And that just doesn't work. That results in chaos because not everybody has context over everything. Like if you are an accountant, then I want you to manage my treasury. You're the person to do that. Not somebody who's never managed a corporate treasury before or even managed a personal budget before. I don't want that person managing my organization's treasury because that's going to result in pure chaos. And that also reminded me of a question that Zach asked on Twitter, Fifth World Zach. He asked, what are some inspiring examples of real world impact through Web3 that you've seen from Bloom Network?
There's one in Rio de Janeiro. They're called Muda. In Portuguese, it means seedling or change. And they have a regional token economy, and they've had it for a long time. I feel like they started in like 2018 or something. It's similar to that pattern I described about our global tokenomics. So people can receive muda for doing everything from supporting Black-owned businesses to meditating or going for a walk. And then they started seeing some spam dynamics with the easier impact things, and it was hard for them to vet them. So I think they've modified it a little bit, but doing a beach cleanup, sharing Spanish lessons with someone or guitar lessons or something. And they mostly made it for people who are living in the favelas so that they could access healthier practices. They start to build community. And again, they have this medium to exchange services with one another. So it's like a hybrid time bank as well, as far as I understand how they use it. You can use your muda to purchase things in the community. I don't know how many users they have off the top of my head, but it's sizable. So it's in adoption decently well. And one thing they started doing is they noticed that access to healthy food was something that a lot of people in the network were wanting. And so they found a nonprofit sponsor to buy community CSA baskets from organic farms that are just outside the city limits. And they also trained those local farms how to set up a CSAA. So a CSA is community supported agriculture. It's so like people buy a subscription box. So it helps offset the costs of farming, it helps spread the risk of crop failure. And they combine it with arts. It's like community supported arts and agriculture. And I think part of it is like that artists are able to receive the boxes. But that has been extraordinarily popular, and a lot of people are adopting muda so that they can use that, and it further, greases the wheels of that liquidity of, the gifts that people have to share in the community, and up levels how healthy they are with each other. And they're connected with a group called Cambiatus that's doing land conservation with NFTs and a bunch of other interesting crypto stuff. But I'm always surprised more people in the Ethereum community are aware of this group because it's so effective and has been so long running. I think that's the main example of a bloom using cryptocurrency. There's Giveth. A lot of people who work on Giveth live at that a Diamante Bridge Collective in Costa Rica that I described. And so that was integral in the early days, especially of funding some of their work. We've been connecting them with Collectivo to do their Geo NFT thing, to have a nature-backed stablecoin. I really think that's the next kind of experiment with cryptocurrency that's going to help them further root the activities they're doing and make them sustainable, because it's still not a normal market economy situation. So there needs some different infrastructure for that to be workable long-term, I think. And so that kind of setup, I believe people can pay their phone bill with whatever tech stack Collectivo has set up. So yeah, I'm hoping that happens. I think Collectivo hasn't quite started their pilot projects with other communities other than what they've been doing in Curacao successfully. So yeah.
How would a nature-backed NFT work?
Yeah, let's see if I can remember the conversations we have with them about it. So it's a geo NFT, so you mark a polygon on a map. All the activities that happen within this polygon, planting trees and doing agroforestry, which is food producing trees, and different levels of agriculture that restore an ecosystem but also provide food for the community and value added food export things that people can make for money. And that's a common pattern we see through local blooms, is like a hybrid commercial agroforestry with community food sovereignty and repairing the native plant ecologies. I think Collectivo was looking at using an agroforestry methodology and a coral reef methodology, though they also do social impact, economic sovereignty stuff as part of their normal work. I think they weren't quite sure yet how to formalize that into a credit, because you can sell the agroforestry credits on like a carbon market or something. And then they've been working on a tech stack to back the reserve of this currency with the money that's coming in from selling those carbon credits and stuff. And then you can also back it with a mix, like a basket of that country's currency or stable coin or something like that as well. But the point is to, as much as possible, anchor it to that ecological value that's being done in that polygon. Then whatever the word that community chooses to use for their currency is what they actually circulate. But it's backed by this treasury of nature assets and potentially some other tokens that help buffer that.
Super cool. Are there any other use cases, sort of like this nature-backed NFT that we just talked about, of how we can use blockchain technology or crypto to improve on our ecology for regenerative culture. I think we're just still in the early days of ReFi, regenerative finance, and what that can unlock. Have you brainstormed any other ideas, or where would you like to see the future of ReFi?
One thing I think is going to be very possible with tokenomics that is very hard and slow when it comes to federal level policy and state level policy is subsidizing regenerative agriculture or community farming, community farm land access, or putting farmland into trusts and stuff so it's like in perpetuity local economic sovereignty essentially. So I want to experiment with this in the Northeast US. We're kind of experimenting with a bioregional scale local bloom. And it's very clear the local farmers need some kind of subsidy. Lawyers and academics and farmers, everyone's strategizing on how to do it through the state system and so forth, but it's very slow. And they're really interested in forming a local farm DAO. I was shocked that they're into it, but it's very exciting. The Bloom Network has a subscription model, or we will once we plug our Web3 infrastructure in. So you pay the equivalent of $10 a month, for example. Most of it goes into your local treasury. Some of it goes to the international one. But if we had a regional DAO, and people are voluntarily paying in, say, $10 a month, they get access to all the peer-to-peer incubator tools that we have on our global network. They get a social network specifically customly built for peer-to-peer local organizing and building more connectivity between different local market actors and so forth. And then they can use that treasury to, say, do a regional subsidy to all local farmers. And so that is like a hybrid, getting money like that to flow, but also is building relationships with people, because once you're a member of that kind of network, you start to, oh, I actually know the farmers who live near me. I'm going to start getting my food from them instead of the grocery store that's shipping stuff from carbon intensive methods. This region has a very high capacity for local farming. There's a lot of small farmland intact, whereas a lot of regions in the US, I don't know what it's like farm specific in a lot of different countries, but like big corporate giant farms is kind of what the federal lobbying process has evolved to support for the most part. But the Northeast US is an exception. I think we can get at least 40% of our local food regionally produced and increasing more than that. But yeah, I think tokenomics makes that kind of subsidization much faster than like pushing large scale policy stuff is very, very slow and takes a ton of resources. And we need to be moving as quickly as possible. People are going to start migrating in like larger and larger scales as their food systems and nature ecosystems start to break down more and more. So yeah, that's one of the things that I think is going to be possible. The other thing we've thought about a lot is if you have a local currency in one place and your own cultures and norms about however you're handling your local treasuries and optimizing for your local tokenomics, how do you then translate that with people in another place over here? And so one thing I'm really curious about how we evolve with these systems is the mesh infrastructure for peer-to-peer token exchanges across locations. I've done some thinking about if I have my local currency here in Diamante Bridge Collective, can I order whatever food product we don't grow here from this other bloom over here, and we can just pay for it with like trade our ecological repairing activities for each other, basically, instead of have to go through expensive exchange rates through normal currency and ship stuff through a carbon boat. Like, we have our own solar fleet. Yeah, I mean, that's a couple ideas so far.
Yeah, that is a really good question. Like, if you're in the Northeast and you have NE token in your local government that you use, and then I'm in the Northwest and I have NW, how do we exchange things with one another with our different currencies? I do think it would be cool if there's a way to directly exchange that instead of going through USD and then convert that into your NE token to buy things from you. But yeah, do you have any final thoughts about Bloom Network, about ReFi in general, about ecological causes we should be aware of? Any final thoughts for us?
I guess one of the things to point out is, what do we not know about what's happening with climate change? Yeah. And I think one of the things that it seems to me most people, and including Web3 people, don't really know is like there's millions and millions and millions of people working on it every day because they have to survive, because their kids have asthma, because there's extractive power plants, because they can get away with being installed there because the people don't have economic power to push back. And there's community-owned solar efforts going on. Co-op Power is one of them in the US. CJA, Climate Justice Alliance, also does organizing around that. food movements like La Vie Campesina, which is like landless peasants movement. They're people who have been pushed off of their indigenous lands, and they're farmers and regional agroecologists. And I think a lot of these movements are extraordinarily underfunded. People who are like disenfranchised from the dominating economic system. And a lot of the efforts that ReFi communities are doing, there's like an in-between too, where people are collaborating with local communities and it's very rooted. Like Agroforest DAO is one of those examples. Web3 Beach is doing this. I think Ioweka in Uganda. But there's still a lot of effort going into these top-down systems where external parties are buying land and reforesting, which is cool, but the volume of people who have capacity to take action already have really sophisticated knowledge of what's effective for taking action and are still very, very extremely underfinanced. I guess I'd like to see more attention and influx and support going to those movements. And I think some of the educational aspects that we talked about earlier in this call will help with that. The more we get that streamlined and understandable for people who are very, very non-technical, that'll help with that as well. So yeah, I guess that's my main thing to point out, because there's like so much innovation happening in all those communities too. They understand so deeply their local ecologies and they figured certain things out that are very easily scalable to other places, or like, oh, I can see how we could do that but change it for our local climate or whatever. So yeah, that's something I'd love to see happen more, and those people's leadership be more supported. And they're also incredibly good innovators. When I see those kinds of people participate in building technology or incorporating technology tools, they're also extraordinarily fast and effective at it because they're so rooted in this direct relationship and have no leeway to make a mistake, right? And so they tend to understand and adapt the tools for protecting their local environments and economic sovereignty. And I think that's one of the changes that needs to happen with the next phase of ecosystem growth in Ethereum and a few other chains.
Do you have any resources or links you can point people to for how they can discover these local, smaller organizations or smaller communities that are doing really cool stuff? Because there's so many organizations out there who claim to be doing certain things and then they're actually not using the funds in a very good way. Do you have any resources or links?
Well, one is like, that's why we're making Bloom, is because it's so hard to find that stuff. We don't have a huge library of organizations up there yet, but everything there is in that category. And those people are also very well connected to their local who is doing what in those spaces. And then Lush Cosmetics, they run a thing called Lush Spring Prize. And they have a list of recipients that are all similarly on this grassroots scale that are doing this hybrid of ecology repair and local economic sovereignty, and also like cultural repair and healing and decolonization. So again, there's not a ton of links up there, but all of those are very solid examples of what is happening. And then those two solar organizations I mentioned, Climate Justice Alliance and Co-op Power, Landless Peasant Movements, or La Vie Campesina is a really good one, because they're also like a aggregator organization. So they try to aggregate the farmers that displaced people's movements in all these places. And there was one last one I wanted to mention, which is indigenous leadership organizations. For the most part, those are also like very underfunded. However, they use the funds very well, and it supports their leadership and their ability to guide the rest of us because they've been here a lot longer time. So yeah, groups doing Earth Law, which is like where you give corporate personhood to a river or a mountain or a species or something. And that works pretty good for like land defense for indigenous folks who are trying to push back against pollution and stuff, because it's part of their governance. Like technically this type of wild grain is a member of our governance community, and because we have governance sovereignty, you're not allowed to disrupt that process, and so you are not allowed to continue doing this pollution that harms that body of our governance. There's a bunch of Earth Law organizations around the world working with indigenous people's leadership around that line of earth defense. They're doing watershed repair, reforestation, and then all the like defense stuff that comes in with that. 85% of the world's biodiversity is within indigenous people's lands. So supporting their defense and ability to not have more of their land destroyed by oil and this kind of thing is a really high leverage point. And I've heard of a lot of indigenous communities who are using and leading and building cryptocurrency tools and different eco credits and so forth. So yeah, that's another group whose leadership is extremely valuable and could use more support.
So interesting. I've learned so much. I was not aware of most of the things that you just talked about. So I feel enlightened after this conversation. And then for our last question, this is something we ask every guest on the podcast. I'm going to give you 3 questions actually from our community and let you pick one to answer. So the first question is from Meg Lister. And it is, what's your favorite crypto drama? And tell us about it. The second one, also from Meg Lister, is who would you invite on the podcast next season? And then the third question you can choose from is from Floppy Abe, and it is, estimate your success rate in your attempts to crypto pill your off-chain friends and family members. Paint me a word picture of your average attempt.
Oh my goodness. I think I probably know nothing about the first or the third. Like, I've heard of a couple dramas, but not enough to comment on. Who do I know that I would recommend to be on the podcast?
Well, actually, you mentioned somebody who was nominated this season and was very close to making it on, and that was Web3 Beach. So
cool.
That's one that I would like to see nominated again next season. Plus one. But if there's anyone else, if there's anyone else you have in mind, feel free to. But that was just one that you mentioned, and I was like, Web3 Beach. We were trying to get them on this season.
Yeah, they are farther ahead than Bloom, I would say. Simona Pop, I think, had done a ETH bounties thing for people doing beach cleanups and plant trees and that kind of thing. And so they're directly doing that immediately right now. They raise money through Gitcoin and other pathways. And then they are starting to build relationships with people in different places. And then they'll, here's some money to do this thing. All right, you guys all did this. Here's your distribution of this pot of money we had. So they're more directly implementing the stuff I've been talking about so far.
Great to know. Well, let's get them on the podcast next season for sure. Let's make it happen. Well, last thing, Magenta, tell people where they can find you if they want to connect with you personally, and then also where people can go to learn more about Bloom.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter as Magenta Ceiba, magenta like the color, and my last name is Ceiba. And I'm on LinkedIn if people do LinkedIn. Check out flowerpunks.com because I've been putting art there. And I'm about to release like a whole NFT thing. That's like a template for like the finance payment splitters we'll do for Bloom, because all our community are artists. So pretty art is going to land on Flowerpunks. And then you can see some other of my art at magewrites.com, and also like writings on regenerative finance in general, including for like psychedelic businesses. And then lastly, Bloom Network is at bloomnetwork.earth is our URL. You can find local blooms there. You can apply to start one. And we just started this Bloomers Without Borders. So if you want to apply your professional skills to Bloom Network itself and the needs that the local blooms have, we're trying to squad mode that. So kind of do what I do with applying my professional tech skills to that community and invite more people to do that. We're getting some bites there already and like really, really epic people starting to come together. So that's going to be a fun place if you want to support Bloom Network. So yeah, that's bloomnetwork.earth, and we're on Twitter at our Bloom Network. But the URL is where most of the community reporting happens and where you see the stories from the members and so forth.
Awesome. I'll include all of that in the show notes. I'm also going to dig up all the projects you mentioned along the way and include them in the show notes to make it easy for people to find those specific projects you've mentioned. But yeah, thank you so much for taking the time, Magenta, and I will talk to you soon.
Thanks, Diana.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Rehash. Rehash is hosted, produced, and edited by me, Diana Chen, and sponsored by Quest and Lore. Rehash is also supported by our community of NFT holders who curate our guest lineup each season. To get involved, head over to our website at rehashweb3.xyz and collect this episode as an NFT. Anyone who collects an episode becomes part of the Rehash community and will be able to nominate guests for future seasons. To learn more about how to become a guest on the podcast, go to rehashweb3.xyz/podcast. And to learn more about sponsoring the podcast, go to rehashweb3.xyz/sponsor. Finally, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at rehashweb3 or on Lens at rehash.lens. And don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.